From its founding as a black church during the time of Jim Crow, St. Luke's has always had a heavy interest in issues of justice, seeing it not just as social issues but as gospel mandates. The gospel mandate is that mandate of what's the most important thing, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, both of those together. And that if we love our neighbors as ourselves, then the idea of living in a way that there is justice for all is an important part of that. To be just is just to be in right relationship. I mean, that's what it really means. It's to be in right relationship. And so are we in right relationship with the land and the air and the water when we exploit it and pollute it? Are we in right relationship with each other when we create situations that provide barriers to everybody having what they need to exist? Are we in right relationship to each other when we put barriers in place that divide people instead of bringing them together? You can just go on down the line. So the gospel mandate, I guess if you wanted to put those words with it, every now and then I talk that way. Usually I don't, but I think the gospel mandate is that we are to be in relationship with one another in which we live love in action. And given the fact that there are many different types of justice issues, types of injustices, for this week I wanted to look at economic justice, and part of the reason for that was the gospel that is appointed for today tells the story in Matthew, the way Matthew tells it, of the wedding banquet, where the king invites all the people that should be invited to the wedding banquet and they won't come. And then things get kind of weird, and there's all this violence that goes on. He sends back people to try to get them to come. They kill the messengers. He gets mad. He destroys their city, and then sends people out into the streets to bring in all the poor and the outcasts and bring them to the wedding feast. And as I started thinking about that, usually one of the things that hits me is the bringing everybody in and giving people a place at the table. And I've just kind of discarded some of that stuff that doesn't fit, like all the violence that happens, that seems out of place. But this time I read that, and it caught my attention. And the part that came right at the last of that piece caught my attention, because after all the people have come in from these different places, and the king has been the one that said, go out and bring them all in, he comes across a guy and he just gets furious because the guy doesn't have on the right kind of wedding garment, and he throws him out. And it's always bothered me. It was kind of like, what? You know, I mean, you invited him in. How is he supposed to have the right kind of wedding garment? And what started coming to me was that in all that story, if you kind of take it out of the way we usually try to tell it and just look at the situation that's the setting of the story, there are a lot of bad policies going on in that story, just that create these situations, and some of them obviously led to violence, but here's this policy of finally these people who never had a seat at the table get to come in and they get to have a seat at the table, and then through no fault of their own, because they don't have what they need to really engage in the party and the celebration, they get thrown out. And that started talking to me about justice, and particularly about economic justice, and some of the things that I've been learning about economic justice. So in trying to find a point about economic justice, I started doing some research, because I think out of all the justice issues, I know least about economic justice than any of the others. I can probably talk about environmental justice or restorative justice or racial justice easier. But economic justice was sort of a puzzle for me. And so I started doing research. And one of the things that I started with was, since this idea of policy had come up to me, I really started looking just for quotes about policy. And a name of a person came up, a well-known economist today who works with things such as policy and how that can become barriers, and his name's Gayle Hamilton. And what the search led me to was an article written by him and two other people. It's Gayle Hamilton, Mark Paul, and William Darity Jr. And it was an article that was entitled An Economic Bill of Rights for the 21st Century. And as I scanned that article, I found this quote. And this quote is what became then the point for pondering today in terms of economic justice. The quote is, "Let us be clear, our economic reality is not mere circumstance. These are the result of policy choices." And that was important to me because I realized that it isn't just enough to have a seat at the table. That's the first step. You have to be in the room and have a seat at the table. But if you're seated at the table and you don't have what you need to do what you need to do, it still is a barrier. And the barrier of how our policies, whether those are governmental policies or whether they're business policies or social policies or individual policies, can set up a reality where a person never gets past just sitting and watching everybody else eat. My understanding of what economic justice really is has changed. I think based on my own experience of economic justice and how I grew up, economic justice would be doing whatever you could do to allow people to help better themselves, which usually meant more education and more job opportunities. Okay, and I think some of that narrative came from the story in my family of my father supposedly pulling himself up by the bootstraps from being born in an immigrant family. His grandparents immigrated from Lebanon towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century is when he came. That would have been my great-grandfather, that is. His wife was Effie, and she also was from Lebanon. And their first child, Adele, my grandmother, was born in this country. So that was the first generation of what is the Shaheen branch of the family born in this country. So my dad was the second of that generation born in this country. And they were not regarded real well, but they were respected. And they didn't have a lot of social mobility, but they understood that if they worked really hard in America and if they got the education they needed, they would be able to better their lives and the lives of the generations that would come after them. So they did that with a grocery store and raising produce for the grocery store, and then eventually that produce business becoming another business. And though a lot of that generation of my grandmother's siblings didn't have a really advanced education, they did really well for themselves through the grocery store and through the produce business, primarily a produce business. My father was sort of the boy that they wanted to be all-American, and they did not teach him Arabic. They didn't speak Arabic around him. They tried to distance themselves, except for their ethnic community that stayed together to support each other and to be there for each other, and the food they cooked and things like that, and the emphasis on family. Other than that, they tried to really melt into being American. And so that was all to kind of push and give my father, looking back on it, probably the opportunity that maybe they hadn't had. And so they did push education with him, and he did become very well educated, and he did do very well for himself, and ended up being the president of a bank eventually. But a lot of that was created with some distance from his identity. The fact that his mother had married a Norwegian man named Hansen, that was his last name. His last name wasn't Shaheen, so his last name was Hansen. So, there were some distance things that separated him from that immigrant experience, in addition to his education and his brilliance, his intelligence, and his ability to understand situations. So the narrative that I grew up with from that was that if you work hard, if you get your education, if you're basically intelligent and use that intelligence, if you treat people right the way you want to be treated, and if you do the things you're supposed to do, you will succeed, even if you came from a poor immigrant family. Recently, as I look around at what's happening now, what I notice is that isn't necessarily true. You can do all of those things and be an immigrant today and not have the ability, the upward economic mobility that my father had, and to an extent some of his uncles had, not so much my grandmother. I look at a black family and realize that even being as successful and having the academic degrees and all of the intelligence and everything else, that most of the data shows that their economic mobility is still less than, say, for a white male especially, but white females too. If you look at a white person who has grown up in poverty and had to depend on the education of a neighborhood in which they grew up that didn't have some of the advantages, that white person will be stuck at that level too because of the neighborhood they started in. If you look at what it costs now to even get a higher education, I look at my own children and see that to get a higher education, they've had to go into incredible debt. I look at my own children and see that they haven't had the access to health care that I had, because it was understood that the policy was when you worked for a reputable company, at least half of your health care would be paid for. That's not true today. So as I look at my own life, and as I look at people who have been more disadvantaged than I think I have been growing up, I see that even some of the same things that were true for my father and that immigrant family he came from in his day don't seem to be as true today. And so I'm just beginning to see that it isn't just a matter of getting the education, it's also a matter of, can you get the education, even if you're brilliant? Can you afford to get that education? And if you do what you need to do to afford it, will you ever get out of debt and be able to build any wealth after that? I've also seen how important it is when there's generational wealth that's been built up, and it's possible for kids like mine to not have to take out big debts because there's been so much generational wealth built up that they have that backing, and parents are able to pay for a lot more expenses. We were never able to do that. And my father was, for us, for an undergraduate degree, and I didn't realize how special that was. But we were not able to do that for our own children because something changed in there, and we did not have the same kind of mobility that I think the generation before us had, and certainly the generation after us has less than what ours does. And when I say mobility, I'm talking economic mobility. I'm talking about the ability to move in terms of income, in terms of earnings, in terms of accumulated wealth. That all has to do with upward mobility, and it can be in terms of a generation, or it can be in terms of generations. There was always an understanding for a while that each successive generation would do better than the generation before that. But that wasn't true for all of us in my generation. It was true for some of us who had more of a buildup of, I think, wealth sometimes than we did, or just happened to be in something that was right on the cutting edge, say, of technological advances, and they had the experience and the degrees and the intelligence that they fit that niche. But for just the overall the overall ability to move from, say, lower class to middle class, from middle class to upper class, it's harder now. And so I'm beginning to ask why. What's different? Are people stupider? Well, no, I don't think so. Are they lazier? No, not really. I mean, I read something the other day. It was saying, it's hard to pull yourself up by the bootstraps if you don't even have boots. And so I think that's kind of part of what that quote means. That when we look at the economic reality today, and the fact that there are people that really can't move very much within that economic reality, it's not always just their circumstances. Sometimes it's the policies that we have, whether they're governmental, business, individual, or what else, the policies that prevent them from making the best of what they have. Policies can be barriers, policies can be solutions. And that is the part that I realize I really don't know that much about. And so there's a barrier there, that when you don't really understand how the policies we have can either serve as barriers or solutions, you're really kind of flying blind. And I think I've been flying blind a lot about economic justice, and the fact that I don't know enough about the way policy works in relationship to economic justice. The more research I've been doing, the more I'm discovering things that I want to learn more about. For instance, I would love to know, even if I look back at my own family and when they first came here, what kind of policies were in place then that made it possible for them to make those moves and do what they were doing. Not necessarily governmental policies. We always, as soon as we say policies, everybody thinks governmental policies, and that is a part of it. But it's also business policies, it's also individual policies, it's also social policies and cultural policies. And so in terms of economic justice, where we all have what we need, I think we need to give more attention to what policies do and how they work.